All right, there we go. Recording started. Welcome to the January 7th edition of the Stabilization Brigade meeting. This meeting is recorded, so please remember that during the discussions and share only that information which you expect you want recorded. As you can see, people are registering their attendance in the chat group with the @here message. We do take minutes for this meeting via the chat rooms, so please register your attendance by doing the @here. Additionally, as we go through the meeting, you'll see @topic, @item, other symbols. If you want to add something to the meeting minutes, please just do a @item, and it will be recorded as well. After the meeting, hopefully, if I remember, I will post the video of the meeting to YouTube as well, so people can look at it later, as well as post the minutes where they can be found online as well. All right, we've got really some review items and then one meeting topic item, which Zach is augmenting right now. So the review items should go fairly quickly. There's not a lot here. The unit test coverage, unit coverage. Nothing much has changed since before the end of the year holiday. That is sort of expected because not a lot of work was done over the holiday, at least in many places. There was a little slight dip in the coverage for the OpenOLT adapter, which probably means some code was added without additional unit tests, bug fixes, that type of thing, but nothing huge there. So hopefully we'll see more change coming in the coming week. Not change. For the Jira and patch set update, again, most people were on break, so there wasn't a huge amount of change, kind of a normal number of issues solved since the last Brigade meeting. There are currently 72 issues in progress or in to do. The big thing I think we need to continue to address is 44 patch sets that are, yesterday at least when I did the snapshot, are still pending review and merged. So that number is getting quite large again, and we need to spend some time reviewing. I did notice that there were some reviews going on yesterday, and some of the patch sets are waiting feedback and edit based on those reviews. But again, it's just getting to be a rather large list, and that's going to make a lot of rebasing and merging a little more difficult as that goes forward. So we do need to reduce patch set backlog. Please take some time today to review patch sets, and if they are reviewed with a +2 or more and no negatives, please, if you have the power, do get those merged in so we can get that list down. Any comments on those two items, either test coverage or patch sets, before we move on to the final agenda item for today? All right, moving on to the last item about freezing tool versions. Just the background for this was yesterday there was some chat on Slack where people were seeing different behavior on different toolset versions between Golang and some of the other tools. It was brought up that to have a more consistent build, that we might want to say, look, we're building with a set of tools and specify those so that everybody can get reproducible behavior. Is that a fair clarification, description of the issue for those people that were on Slack or saw it on Slack?
Was this Kent's issue with compiling Volta Protos, or was this a different issue?
Yeah, it was prompted off that, and then I think Zach chimed in with some issues around Go format as well, or someone chimed in with some issues that the protos might not be generating the code in the same Go format compliant way around that.
I think that was me who added
Okay.
that based on just looking at the diff comparing the patch that Kent had. So yeah, is Kent on? It seemed
Yeah,
like his problem just went away, but
it
maybe.
was very strange. I'm not sure what exactly what's going on in this particular case. I think what I think Zach mentioned um, that's more interesting as a discussion is, do we want to pin sort of all the versions and have them as a set, and then sort of pin a next version of everything as well, and that way we'd be able to migrate projects over without having to migrate all the repos at once. So a repo could specify, okay, I want to use, this set of all the versions, and this is what I'm expecting, and then sort of be able to migrate the repos one at a time to new versions and still be just as specific with what we want to use.
Yeah, I think both Kent and Scott are right. So the issues that as I think what we ran into was right now we have certain pinned versions because the way that the tests are working, at least in the Protos case, is we want to make sure that because people are checking in both the Proto file and generated code from that, at least in the Golang version, we want to make sure that what is checked in is what is generated from those files. So everything is internally consistent. So the way that we did that is we run the protobuf compiler again in the test environment, and then do basically a git diff. And if it sees any differences between those things, then we know that the person, what we supposedly know is that the person updated, maybe updated the proto without updating the compiled the proto C compiler output. And that's good for consistency, but it is annoying because people then have to go dig up a specific version of the protobuf compiler. I don't think we're ever going to get away from pinning versions of that, just because there isn't a good other way to check that without having to distribute a protobuf compiler and have everybody do that as a part of their build process on every other system. And I think it does increase consistency.
One solution to that, we could build the protos inside of a Docker container where we have absolute control over every piece of software that's installed in it.
We could do that. The downside of that is that then there's a dependency on Docker, and then there's the problem of getting data in and out of the Docker container. And I think that's probably worth pursuing.
I guess what I'm concerned about was Kent had this trouble, even though we believe he had everything pinned correctly, and still weirdness happened, and
right.
We don't really have a good explanation for why the weirdness happened. It went away on its own, which is good, but that also means it can happen again to someone else, and we still don't know why it's happening. I think there's a lot of variability in how these tools get installed on a person's environment.
Yes,
So did we not identify the issue Kent was having then, or why he generated different code?
So I reinstalled different versions of Proto-C and Proto-C Gen Go, and then I still had the problem, and then about 10-15 minutes later it just vanished. So I'm not sure if I changed my version and it didn't pick it up, or if it's inconsistently generating different code, if it's not actually doing what it's supposed to and generating the exact same thing every time. I just don't know. The biggest question I have is, is the problem I had, which is it kind of went away on its own, and I don't think we can solve it in this discussion because I wasn't able to trace it because it just vanished. So I don't know if that's a valuable discussion. I think what is a valuable discussion is more what are the versions we've pinned and how do we recommend people install them? Because I don't know if I broke something because I installed things differently. And it's just, it's an open question. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think that's a good point. I'm taking a little bit longer view. There was a previous document that came up that was related to the update process for the tooling dependencies that was brought up beginning of last month. I'll paste a link to it in the chat. Basically, one of the things that I think we're going to need to do is decide, as I think, Kent, you mentioned having like a pinned version and then having a next version of tools that we use. And then as development continues, one of the problems we've encountered is as tools evolve, they start noticing more possible errors, raising more warnings and other such issues that are good that they're being found, but if it happens on older code, you don't want to have your CI system start rejecting code that was previously accepted. So one of the options that we could do is have a way of specifying every version of every tool and then have a way to select that in the CI system. That seems like a nightmare because we'd have to be very specific, and then we run down this chain of which of the 10 different tools we're using or 3 different tools we're using is causing all these new errors to occur. So what I'm thinking might be better to do is for us to come up with a set of almost like version specific or release specific groupings of tools. So maybe we say that the 2.2 release used Go 1.12 and Proto-C 3.7.0 and just a list of tools. And then the 2.13 or next, we upgrade some of those tools and we figure out a way to freeze those so that when in the CI environment, we can specify, I want to use the 2.2 revision of the tooling or the 2.3 revision of the tooling. Similarly, how with the ONOS apps we're doing, do you want JDK 8 or JDK 11? You can just sort of get everything as one block of tooling. So that's sort of what I wanted to bring up. I'm in favor of doing that, but I wanted to see what other people were thinking.
Yeah, I think I'm also in favor of, having rigorously specified these versions and having ways to pick, the right set of component versions to go with the right module that we're testing. But everything we do in the CI system, we have to be able to reproduce on a developer's environment too. If a developer starts working on a new component, he needs in his local development environment to get the right Golang, the right Proto-C, etc. So it almost seems to me like we need to have something at the makefile level, at least a makefile target that can check and make sure that you do have the right stuff installed for the repository you're working on. I guess that would be my point to what you said, Zach, is everything we do in the CI environment, we also have to make sure the developer can do on his local machine to make sure his machine is compliant.
I think that's a good point, and I also think that that this matters more for certain repos, like the Protos repo, than it matters for other repos that are maybe just are depending on the Golang major version or major and minor version.
So I would agree. I mean, a make target to be able to say, version check or whatever you want to call it, that for those tools that report version, that can be done. I don't think we can automate the install or should automate the install of the right version of the tools. That should be left up to the individual developer based on platform differences, if nothing else. I'm not convinced that, particularly for the next, if you will, that we can freeze versions at any given point in time, even maybe for the current version, right? We could say today on January 7th or whatever it is, that we're going to freeze to these set of tools, but it may come to be that we need to upgrade the Go version for some specific bugs that's hit in some specific repo. So, I understand the goal of having a set that we move to, but in the end, we're going to potentially be incrementing tool versions independently anyway. Right? So I'm not sure, well, the concept of set makes sense. I'm not sure the implementation's really going to be any different than if we're just tracking a BOM of the current tools versions.
So do we have any examples of where that's happened to date, where we had to update the Golang version or the Proto-C version to deal with a specific bug or a specific feature implementation that a component needed?
I thought we did with Golang, actually. It was trying to remember what it was right now, but I remember something about Golang, to be honest. I think it's infrequent, to be honest, but so at some point someone's going to say, hey, I really need this, and we're going to have to upgrade a tool version. So once we release a version, I think a version like 2.2 is released with a set of tools, and that doesn't really change. But the current version under development always has the potential to change tool versions, I think.
I think that's exactly right. We are going to have a floating next version that we iterate on versions of tooling during the dev cycle, and then at feature freeze or nearing release time, we need to figure out a way to freeze our tools and specify that for this branch we use this set of tooling.
So I think the difference in what David is suggesting and what Zach is suggesting is perhaps whether there's just one next specification at any given time, or whether a particular repo can diverge from next due to a requirement within that repo. Is that accurate, David?
Well, I would actually like to have every repo use the same set of tools, because if we start tracking per repo, I think it becomes very difficult. But the problem is if the proto repo says I have to upgrade a new proto compiler, and that new proto compiler also takes the new version of Go, and we say therefore we have to upgrade every repo, that could, but the upgrade of Go for the proto repo causes a different issue for the Volta core repo. That becomes problematic. I don't know how to get around that right now.
Yeah, I think during the dev cycle, we need to bite the bullet on, okay, we're going to update Go, and that's going to update the lint tools, and that's going to start throwing a bunch of new warnings. And somebody needs to, when there's a change in version, it needs to be announced and just say, hey, we're changing this version. You should do it on your local system, or at least add the ability to run this new version of Golang or Protobuf or whatever. And then maybe we have to assign people, or just make sure that people know that there will be these new sets of warnings or errors or things that they need to deal with, where code might get reformatted differently, or because Go will auto reformat and auto update certain things within your code. There needs to be a pass of that on any probably major minor version update of.
Isn't that going to create issues then? I mean, we are not setting up the people's environment, and we are letting everybody know that there are version updates need to be done, or configuration change needs to be done. In the meantime, I mean, it is going to create issues with people, and we don't support auto updating those things by ourselves, or setting the environment up by ours by the tools. Shouldn't we have at least something that sets the people's environment up right, if they don't have anything set up, or if they don't mind? They'll give us a uniformity.
The minute you get into the uniformity of development environment, to be honest, you're getting into vagrant machines, right? If we wanted to supply a vagrant file for a development machine, okay.
Right.
But we're not, I don't think we're going to want to create scripts that modify your local environment, mostly because people's local environments are just, well, they're personal and they're just too different.
I do prefer having people being able to say, I'm going to go ahead and run this script, or at least I can look at the script and I know that script sets the environment up right. If I don't want to run, if I want to do it manually by myself, fine. But if I don't know how to do it,
right. When I've seen this done in other projects, that's when they start introducing either vagrant machine or what Scott was referencing earlier, have a Docker build.
Yep. We can do a Docker build. I think that's a great idea.
See, so one of the things with the Docker build that I thought was very interesting is that it gives us the potential to bind mount the user's local directory into a container, run whatever tool, like if we're running part of the make script, we can run that in the container, and then return everything back to the user's environment, and the user can use whatever version of Go or whatever version of all the tools in their environment that they want. It would just be the make that really has to be bound to a specific version. Everything else is pretty close, right? You want to be able to run test on a specific version. You want to be able to run lint on a specific version. But most of the time when people are developing, they don't care that much if they're on the exact version or if it's just close enough that they can, get it to build and run.
Right.
So I'm in favor of at least looking into the Docker solution. It seems very clean, at least from the outside.
In Sonic builds, we do that. Our engineers, even they can use Ubuntu 18. Sonic uses Ubuntu 16, but we have Dockers. Everything is installed on Docker. You just instantiate it and run the build there, and it really is very clean. You can change the Docker from one Docker to another one and have different set of tools. But it is a very uniform environment. The builds work every time, and it's very predictable.
Yeah, and I think we're also already using Docker to do a lot of our building. When you build like the core components, that you're primarily invoking make Docker build, and I believe it does actually do the compile inside of a Docker build container that goes in the final container. So we already do builds this way to an extent. I think if we were to start with something like just the Volta Protos repo, which is the most problematic one because it has these Proto-C and Proto-C Gen Go requirements, just maybe try moving that to a Docker build, see how that works out for us, and then maybe consider starting to move linting or other tasks that are problematic over to Docker containers.
Yep.
I think that's a good starting approach. The one thing I'm hesitant about is for sort of lightweight actions like some of the lint and code quality and those sorts of tools. Running those in a Docker container might extend the development cycle. If you have to wait for a Docker container to build and copy everything over, and as opposed to just running like the Golang CLI lint tool or whatever the lint target is. That's the only concern I have, is that whether we want to support both running those sorts of frequently used developer cycle commands, and whether those are going to be tied to a Docker environment or whether you can run them outside.
One of the things I thought was interesting, I saw when I was looking at the current lint tool, I don't remember the name of it. It has an option to be run sort of, you run it as a Docker container, but you just bind mount the directory you're trying to lint. And so it's basically, all the copying is free because it's technically still running locally. The only thing that's really bound to the container is the exact version of the lint tool that you're trying to run. And I thought that was a very interesting way of doing it. Like, you're only sort of half using Docker. You're just using it to pin the versions exactly how you want, but you don't have to waste all the time copying.
Yeah. You never copy the files from
Yeah.
like your storage, wherever the location was. You just Docker contain the tools that you're using. Everything else is mounted, so there's no copying.
Yeah, it's not like using a Docker file. You're
No.
just doing a Docker run with a
Right.
given container and specifying your mount points.
Right.
So I do think there is some startup time involved, but it's fairly light for most containers. And as Kent said, you're just mounting things. You're not copying in and out. The thing I've seen around this is file permissions based on the user that's in the Docker container, being used in the Docker container, because the files are written back to the mount, I think, using its file, its user ID, and its group ID. And so I think we have to be careful about that, if I recall. But the performance I haven't seen as much of an issue. The UMask may be based on what's in the Docker container or the Docker image as well. However, giving it a try in the Protos repo, I'm kind of in favor for. Is there anybody who's against doing that, at least trying it out with the Protos repo? Is there anybody who's wants to actually do the work? I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, it'd be fun to do or a good idea to do, but we need to actually have someone do it.
I'd be interested in trying it out. Do we have a general Jira for this already, or is this going to be new?
I'm not aware of a Jira.
I might have one. I'll look and let you know, Kent.
Okay.
So you're willing to take on that task and look at it for the proto repo and see what we come up with?
Sure.
Okay. Any objections to that? Anyone to this plan? All right. Let's go forward with that then.
So back to Zach's general point that started this, do we want to document these versions that we're installing, specify them someplace? Or maybe we've just localized it by containing it within Docker. I guess I'm wondering, do we still want a current and next specified someplace?
I'm not sure what current means, because if current is the current development cycle, I think that's we want it specified, yes. But current be what we're actively developing, 2.3, and next 2.4 here in this case? What is current, what is next? Because one of those is going to change.
The release and devel would be better. The last one we released and the current one we're developing.
Right, and release would be released multiple. Yeah, you'd have I always thought of it as next to being whatever's in flux in the current development process, and then when we cut a release, we also cut a set of versions of dependent components. And
So,
then
yeah.
like a 2.2 components, 2.3 components, 2.4 components going forward that gets cut as a part of the release engineering process.
I think we want a BOM based on version.
Right.
Is what it comes down to. I do think we do want to document that, regardless of the outcome of the Docker build, having that in a README somewhere or some sort of form that we can track is useful.
So what was the issue with pinning the versions individually in the makefile, for example, the versions of each tool?
I don't think there is a reason or a I don't think that is a big concern. I think it's more of a concern where it's important, which is, I think one outcome of this might be that we decide this is the right approach for the Volta Protos repo, but it might be too onerous in terms of updating and keeping track of everything and changing everybody's versions over in Docker files, and if we did it to every other repo. So,
well, this wouldn't be in a Docker file. At least what I'm envisioning that Kent's going to be doing is creating a Docker file that is the Volta build image. And that same Volta build image would be used on every repo. So there would be no difference per repo once we have this build image.
Well, the question is, so first of all, I see it being a set of build images, sort of for each tool, mostly just to keep it as small as possible. And then I don't know if those are all versioned together as one chunk or individually.
A set of well, okay. I'm not sure if we need to take that offline as kind of a how do we design this issue or not.
My main question had to do with the set of tools we're talking about pinning. If that's if we're trying to pin all of them as a set, now, like, basically, are we only pinning all of them as a set because it's useful for release, or does it make more sense to sort of pin all the versions of all the tools individually, and then whenever we have to update one, we can just update that one, and not have to update all of them at the same time necessarily?
I think, at least for the version under development, the next, if you will, I guess, is each of those tools is going to have to be able to change version independently. So I don't, well, the concept of a set makes sense from a thought experiment. I think from, at least on the next version, the reality is we need the independence. And if we upgrade one tool, we don't necessarily want to have repercussions on the other tool versions. So again, my opinion is we version the tools independently, but there's a bill of materials that basically says, for a given release, this is the versions that we're currently using.
So does that imply that at release time, there would be, for that BOM, we'd assume that all of the repos and all the code in all the repos complies with one specific BOM, or would those BOMs?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I would think we'd want one BOM across all repos at release time that is frozen, and basically we're saying that this release was built and tested with these tool versions.
So let's say we create a Docker tools image, and that image, then we version it and it gets different releases. For example, maybe the first release we upgrade Proto-C, and the next release we update Golang. And then would each of the make files in each of the other repos specify the version level or the version of that Volta Tools image. And as the Volta Tools image increases in version, whoever increases the version is responsible for fixing all the lint errors that are introduced by that change in version of the tools.
Okay, so
I'm not sure where I fit on, sorry, which side I'm on between, do we want to have one, a single Docker image that has all the tools in it under a single version, or does it make sense to have all the tools independently and have the release bomb enforced per project or per repo?
I think at the very least, we probably want the Python tools to be in a separate image than the Golang tools. I mean, maybe the Python tools are completely out of scope for this discussion, but it seems like we don't want to have a jumbo image that has both Python and Go and all of the junk that goes with it.
Right. One of the things I see being nice about multiple images is just they can be tiny, right? With Proto-C, you can put in like the 2 executables that are needed, and it can get a really small image in theory, right? Anyways, I'm not sure.
trying to kind of back off that bit of how we break this up into a build image. I'm trying to get back, trying to understand Zach's question about where that's controlled, I guess. I'm not sure I quite understood what you're trying to get at, Zach.
I think if the goal is that when we do a release, we have a bomb of dependency versions. I guess I want to avoid the situation where when a new version of Golang or one of the lint tools comes along, that gets included in some places but not others. So let's say all the core and the proto buffs get increased to using a new version of Golang, but one of the adapters is left behind and doesn't, and then it comes around release time, and then there's just this mad dash to make everything compliant with the common BOM. I think that's something I'd like to avoid. And if we have a tools repo that then when that gets increased, it's obvious that here's all the new tools that we have to use. It would make more sense to have that be its own sort of release train that gets updated regularly on all the repos.
I think we need the BOM, a single source of truth for the bill of materials that is shared across all the repos. I'm not sure how best to do that. In other words, I don't think we want to track this BOM in each repo, right? And have it in each make file that says here's 10 lines of definition for the different versions of the tools, and have that copied in each make file in each repo. I think that's probably not what we want to do.
It would be something like, so, okay, so we could just do it so we have all the tools, and basically just if the version of one gets bumped, the version of all of them gets bumped. So they're always the same, like pick which one of them you want. And then that's it. I still think they should be packaged independently, but they can definitely be distributed under a single version tag.
So even if we have multiple images, they can all have the same version, but different names. I think I agree with Kent's point on that. It's sort of, you take the multiple container issue and set it aside for the moment. We can, even if we have multiple containers, we can version them all similarly. And then we're just monolithically always marching forward in version number. when you make a new version of all of these, you can run around and update all of the repos to use the new version.
So while we're experimenting with Docker builds, and I have no reason to believe that won't work, what are we doing? Are we going to try to deal with this issue before that's resolved? Or say, just leave it at, hey, we think we're going to need a bomb. We're going to have to keep versions somehow equivalent across the repos. But the specific way we're going to do that, we're going to wait on Kent's feedback around Docker images to see if we go forward. Because if we go forward with Docker images, then yeah, we can use tags to, I'm using Docker, I'm using VoltaLint version 2, GoLang, VoltaGo version 2, whatever. But if we're not using the Docker builds, we're going to have to come up with a different scheme.
I would vote to let Kent try out his Docker builds first, and that whatever repo he puts the Docker file that creates these things in, that becomes our bomb repo. That's the authoritative source of the tool versions. And then we can see how the Docker thing works out. We can adopt that. But I don't think it'd really be a good idea for us to move forward in two different ways, one with a Docker-based build and Docker image-based versioning, and then some parallel effort to version things differently for direct injection into the developer's environment.
Okay, so that's fine. I agree, actually. I think we went down this other path because we said regardless of the Docker stuff, we still need a bomb. And so I think at least what I'm hearing is we're going to have to track that bomb, and we're going to track it in this separate repo, whatever it is. And right now, what we're doing is saying we're experimentally going to enforce that via the Docker container, Docker image build. But we may have to change that if we choose a different implementation mechanism. But at some point in the future, we will have a bomb. It will be in a repo, and so that a developer, if he wants to set up their own environment, not use the Docker build, they can based on that bomb. Else, all the make files will use a Docker build to accomplish uniformity. Is that what people are generally thinking?
I agree with that.
Yep, makes sense to me.
Okay. Any objections to that?
No, that sounds good.
Okay. Okay. I'm trying to summarize that, and I'll summarize that in an item. Will be in I may augment that in post-processing. Any other thoughts, comments on this? If not, we'll close the discussion. Any other topics people want to bring up then today?
Let me ask one follow-up question on this. Say something like voltctl, which we can compile for Windows, we can compile for Linux, and we can compile for Mac. What Docker build container does it use?
Why wouldn't it use this same one, I guess?
I guess as long as we can build into that container the ability to compile for all those environments.
For cross compilation, you mean?
That's built into GoLang and doesn't require any extra work.
Okay, good. So we can cross compile on Linux for Windows or for Mac, and that must be what we're doing now.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Does anybody actually run voltctl on Windows?
Are we not just letting people install it individually, like just via go get or go install? I thought that was
You can do that, but we're also building binaries and distributing them through the GitHub release page.
Okay.
And
Right.
that's advantageous because then somebody can just get them down, check the checksum, and run them without having to have a full Golang build environment and build the tools.
Okay. I just didn't know that was set up. Thanks. All right.
Any other comments or thoughts then, or topics people want to bring up? All right. Then I'll close the meeting, get things posted, and we'll go from there. And Kent, if nothing else, we'll expect something next week at the meeting. But I really don't think it would take that long to at least get some initial comments out on Slack. But if nothing else, we'll expect an update next week. Okay.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending, and see you on Slack or on the next call in about 12 minutes.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.